Greetings, folks, and welcome back to Shangri-La. Now that 2026 is upon us, the 10th anniversary of the release of Hearts of Iron 4 is fast approaching. As of D-Day 2026, gamers all over the world where the game isn't banned will have been LARPing as Hitler and destroying their chances of encountering women for a decade. But that's enough overused Toy 4 player jokes for one day. Today, I've got another DLC review for you all, cooked up warm and mostly fresh from my uncertified and unfunny opinion kitchen. The DLC in question is another iconic one, Man the Guns. I haven't anything funny or glib to say as a segue, so let's stick with the uninspired. Let's get into it. Man the Guns is the second expansion and fourth major DLC for Hoi 4, released on February 28, 2019. Much like Waking the Tiger before it, the DLC was priced at $20 and £20 respectively. Unlike Waking the Tiger before it, however, the DLC was not integrated into the base game until November 20th, 2025. The DLC was released alongside the 1.6 update, nicknamed Ironclad, the initial operation in an ultimately successful Allied campaign to liberate Madagascar from Vichy France. The free update added a few major game mechanics, including fuel, gameplay rules, and varied naval terrain regions. The naval combat system was also reworked, and oodles of releasable nations were added in the Caribbean, Africa, and Yugoslavia, among others. As for the DLC itself, the main mechanic revolves around ship design, completely overhauling the tech trees for naval technology and ship components, allowing you to customize your naval vessels to your heart's content. Or detriment, your choice. Also added were commander traits for admirals, the ability to prohibit vessels from sailing in certain regions of the world, the government in exile mechanic, and one new autonomy state, the supervised state. In the focus tree department, alternative history paths were added for the United Kingdom and United States, alongside new focus trees for the Netherlands and Mexico. Of course, the DLC also added some new songs to the game: Change in Course, Arsenal of Democracy, Confederate Flags, and Shatter the Empires. This DLC received mixed reviews upon release, with the naval designer, arguably the DLC's most defining feature, either making or breaking the whole thing for players. Positive opinions of the naval designer generally revolved around its realism and detail, while negative opinions criticized it as being far too complicated. Other criticisms were directed at the DLC's price tag, noticing a pattern here, an overabundance of newly introduced bugs, the AI being broken or otherwise unable to manage fuel and diplomacy, and the fact that the doubtlessly significant naval mechanics were locked behind a paywall. Its legacy hasn't improved since then, and there was quite a bit of backlash against the devs when it was announced that the DLC would be integrated into the base game. Moving from complaint to content, it's time to dive into the new country content unlocked by this DLC. This DLC doesn't really have any kind of overarching theme to tie the four nations to each other, nor do they occupy one singular geographical region. I guess, if you want to be pedantic, all four of them hold territory in North America, but Newfoundland and Curacao are colonies, whereas Nebraska and Chihuahua are outright states. But anyways, let's start our metaphorical voyage with... The Netherlands starts the game trying to maintain a tricky trade balance between Germany and the United Kingdom, alongside the ramifications of the Great Depression, a manpower shortage, and a fearful aversion to anything military-related, as the country managed to remain neutral during World War I. The Dutch focus tree works to heal these national afflictions, and in doing so, the country must decide whether to maintain the delicate trade balance or concede control of the country's trade to either the Germans or the British. Whichever decision they make influences what ideological route they can go down, be it a nationalistic Benelux reunification campaign, a monarchist takeover that allows you to foment ideologically similar rebellions in Germany, or the foundation of the EU in order to defend European democracies without Britain's assistance. And if the Netherlands does fall to the Germans, they can either set up a government in exile in London or annex their Indonesian colony in order to continue the fight from there. And, of course, if you are forced to go into exile, there are focuses you can take in order to prepare for your eventual liberation and restoration. Mexico is an unstable republic in 1936, having stumbled out of the chaos of the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s and into an era of opportunistic figures trying to consolidate power and influence for themselves and their cronies. Sure, the legitimacy of President Lázaro Cárdenas is relatively undisputed, but figures like Saturnino Cedillo and ex-President Plutarco Calles are quickly becoming undesirable compatriots for the government in Mexico City. Furthermore, tensions from the Cristero War have yet to settle, and the role of the influence of the Catholic Church in Mexican society and government is heavily debated. And as if the situation couldn't get any more undesirable, the United States and United Kingdom have free control over Mexican oil reserves in the east. Mexico's focus tree begins by having you decide whether to placate or purge Calles and Cedillo, while also deciding whether to drive governmental operations further leftward or rightward. Most of the focuses you take will either strengthen or weaken the church's power, which will offend either the clergy or the secularists. Essentially, you're almost always at risk of restarting the Cristero War. However, if you manage to walk the tightrope between an atheist state and quasi-theocracy, or if you manage to shut the opposing side up with either the the aforementioned governments, you'll get to the end of the political path, which allows you to conquer Central America and South America before turning north to strike against the United States, regardless of your ideology. Other branches in the tree allow you to implement economic reforms, how socialistic you wish to go is up to you, and handle the ever-present problem of those foreign oil concessions. Though, a fair warning, outright nationalizing them is a great way to get the Brits and Yankees crawling down your throat.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn?
Ah, the United States of America, my country. I'd imagine you all know at least something about the United States in the mid-1930s, but in the event that you don't, here goes nothing. In 1936, the United States is still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression, though government interventions in the form of the New Deal have been implemented to improve the economy and restructure the nation's economic structure. Internationally, the United States is trying to keep an isolationist approach to conflicts in Europe and Asia, while simultaneously keeping a close watch on the doings of Central and South American countries, the defense of whom the United States assumes per the Monroe Doctrine. Meanwhile, the military has fallen behind the times, with an armament industry lacking the caliber to supply an army capable of defending such a vast country. Essentially, the United States has quite a ways to go before she can take on the rising states of Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. But once the giant wakes, nothing can stop her. I hope that does the Union justice, and I hope I didn't accidentally say anything wrong or misleading. The United States receives two alternative political branches with the DLC. Both of these branches allow you to drift further to the left or the right, although you do not have to necessarily flip ideologies in doing so. Drifting leftward ranges from your average Bernie bro slop to fully going communist, enforcing decolonization by force and toppling global monarchies with the help of either the Soviets or Chinese communists. Meanwhile, drifting rightward allows you to empower the House Un-American Activities Committee and sick 'em on the commies, conquer and dominate the Americas, and collaborate with the German-American Bund and other fifth colonists to, honor the Confederacy. Also, it's worth noting that if you go too far to one end of the political spectrum, you'll end up plunging the country into a civil war. The communist-initiated civil war somewhat resembles the Second American Civil War in Kaiserreich, whereas the fascist-initiated civil war is similar to the First American Civil War, even going as far as allowing you to move the nation's capital to Richmond, Virginia. Oh, and if you didn't know, if Germany ousts the Nazis and Hitler somehow manages to flee the country, there is a chance a man named Adam Hilt runs for president if you go fascist. So that's funny, I guess. The United Kingdom, to some extent, is still on their victory lap following the end of the First World War. Their empire stretches across every continent, their security isn't under immediate threat, and they're rather quickly pulling themselves out of the economic slump caused by the Great Depression. However, the world is quickly changing, and the United Kingdom will have to change with it. Multiple new ideological roots are added to the British focus tree by the DLC. Firstly, while keeping the conservative government in office, you can take the initiative against rising authoritarianism in Europe, abandoning the failed policy of appeasement and seizing control of oil-rich regions around the world. But, however, if you wish to change your ideology, there are three ways you can go about doing that. Firstly, if you side with King Edward VIII during the marriage debate, you can install the king as your country leader, annexing the Dominions after some pro-royalist civil wars, and restoring control over Ireland and the United States. Because Edward VIII was, infamously, a German sympathizer, you can also extend olive branches to the Reich, severing the alliance between them and Italy and leading the fight against the Soviet Union. Alternatively, you can organize Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts and march on London, installing the original gamer himself as your leader. Rather than cooperating with Germany, Mosley strikes up a friendship with Mussolini, the two eventually ganging up against the Reich. Finally, there's a communist path, in which Britannia digs herself a giant hole and beats herself senseless with a shovel until she's red enough. Once your politics are dominated by Polit, though, you must choose between Soviet friendship and British leadership. Then you can strike against Germany and the United States and try to force the empires of Europe to decolonize. However, if you yourself do not fully decolonize within 2 years of becoming communist, you'll end up triggering an inter-communist civil war. Speaking of decolonization, another small branch is added by the DLC that allows you to release various countries en masse and prepare the dominions for independence. And if you're lucky, your computer might not crash and you've achieved all this. And that's all I have to say on the DLC's country content. Or, well, that's all I have to say objectively about it. Well, this DLC didn't excite me very much. I describe it as eh. It's not as good as Waking the Tiger, but it's not as big a dud as Together for Victory. However, that's not to say I dislike everything about it. I really don't care about all the nuances with the naval tech, but I do like the freedom to customize my ships to satisfy my every whim. I don't pay enough attention to the naval warfare to tell you if my designs make significant differences or not. I'm here for the politics and map painting stuff. With that said, let's pick apart the countries one by one, going by the game's alphabetical order. The British paths are a mixed bag. The best one, without a doubt, is the monarchist path. You get a decent helping of foreign policy stuff to to do, and you can pretty easily reconquer your wayward dominions through those pro-royalist civil wars I mentioned previously. And if you can form it, the Imperial Federation is quite the global behemoth. And you can then go the extra mile, doing things like founding the Kingdom of America under Wallace Simpson. The fascist path shares quite a bit of the expansion stuff with the monarchist path, as both ideologies can have Edward VIII as the country leader, but there's very little uniquely fascist content. Plus, it's more difficult to set up. If you're not careful with the Black Shirt marches, you can accidentally trigger a civil war and die instantly. Then there's the communist path. While Hoi 4 has a problem with most communist paths being lackluster and cut from the exact same cloth, the British communist path manages to make it suck even more. Firstly, in order to even flip communist, you have to concede a lot of stuff to the trade unions, eating up your time and resources and greatly handicapping your nation. But once that's over, you get to start asking everyone to begin decolonizing, which, sure, is somewhat unique to Britain, but the problem with decolonizing is that all the newly released countries cause a lot of lag.
Please don't take that out of context.
Basically, the British communist path is the embodiment of the phrase cutting off your nose to spite your face, which, in a sense, is a decently accurate description of communism anyways, so make of that what you will. As for the Netherlands, I find myself really bored every time I play them. Their focus tree, especially the political stuff, takes too long and asks too much to really get going. And even when you're locked onto an ideological path, a lot of it is still pretty dull. Now, this isn't necessarily the devs' fault. Because the Netherlands is basically cradled between Germany and France, you really can't expand your territorial holdings much beyond Belgium, Luxembourg, and perhaps a few extra colonies. That's not to say you can't expand beyond the Benelux, but it's not very feasible until well after Germany is fully armed and France is dead. Maybe that's a bit too nitpicky of me. There are some neat focuses in the Dutch tree, though. I think Wilhelminism is a really interesting idea, as is the relocation of your government to Batavia. Meanwhile, Mexico's focus tree still receives a decent amount of positive buzz nowadays, and I can certainly see why. It's a solid focus tree. I like how the impending Caudillo rebellion and church squabbles always keep you on your toes, and there's little to fear should either region of tension get too hot. The civil wars aren't super difficult, and all it takes is a bit of well-placed micromanagement to win them. Mexico has plenty of leader choices as well, courtesy of the 1940 presidential election, which you can hold regardless of ruling ideology. And flipping ideologies is pretty simple too. There's no complex build-up or game-wrecking civil war, just a handy-dandy national focus. However, the one criticism I will give the Mexican tree is that the conquest sub-branch, though expansive, can get repetitive after a while. After all, if historical AI is off, it's only a matter of time before Guatemala and Honduras are gobbled up by whatever iteration of Mexico the AI established. And if you go just a little bit northwards, you'll find yourself in the United Americans of USA. And in this case, the S stands for shit, because that's what the American DLC paths are. The communist-ish path has been lampooned for years on how shoddily it was put together. For instance, you only need Earl Browder, the CPUSA's leader, in your government for a handful of focuses, and none of the ones that actually make you communist. Also, where advisor checks were lacking, leader checks were not present to compensate. You can enact very leftist policies as any of the 4 possible Republican presidents, in a time where a lot of Democrats would shoot down such policies. And after you've given Johnny Reb another beating, you have to re-emit states into the Union, just like before. However, reintegrating all the states is time-consuming and a massive drain in your political power. And the reward? Nothing! There's hardly any foreign policy focuses to take, other than just attack the other global powers. The fascist path is a little better, it's much more clearly defined, and you have a few foreign policy and expansionism focuses to take once you've changed governments. However, the way you go about starting the fascist path is still almost hilariously unrealistic. The idea that Alf Landon, a liberal Republican who supported elements of the New Deal, would just sit back and allow a fringe movement like the Silver Shirts to go about causing a ruckus is preposterous. Furthermore, Landon rebuked the America First Committee, the namesake of the initial fascist focus, and the isolationists within the Republican Party after Germany invaded Poland. So, congratulations on putting out a DLC with both historically ignorant and politically confused American focus paths and a well-researched and fleshed out Mexican focus tree, I guess. Oh, and just a side note, I like the idea of the US Congress mechanic, but in practice it also doesn't make any sense and swings back and forth a bit too easily for my liking. But anyways, how would I rank the content added for these 4 countries? Well, coming in last place are the alternative American political paths. After them, in 3rd place is the Dutch focus tree. Coming in at 2nd, and this was the toughest one to properly rank, are the British alternative history paths. And therefore, Mexico snags the top spot on my on-the-fly gun-to-the-head ranking that I don't have to think too much about. And if you'll allow me a minute, I'd like to complain about the integration of this DLC into the base game. intriguing. Paradox's excuse for doing this was to simplify certain elements of the code, as integrating all the naval stuff would eliminate the need for them to code in DLC checks for every ship-related focus and the like. However, not only has this not simplified the code at all 4 integrated DLCs are still checked for in the files, but none of this would have been an issue if Paradox didn't have such a short-sighted and frustratingly greedy approach to DLCs. As you've probably figured out by now, Paradox really likes to lock core game functions behind paywalls, thus justifying the $20 plus price tags. And as a result, mod devs and future game devs alike have to go through the headache of writing code for those with a certain DLC and those without. What they should have done, whether from the start or last year, was fully retire the old naval mechanics and replace them with the DLCs, drop the price to that of a country pack, and rework and expand the focus trees and country content for the Netherlands, Mexico, America, and Britain. But unfortunately, if any of these countries get reduxed, it'll be through a future DLC that costs as much as the game itself. I'm calling it now. Whew, glad I got that out of my system. One final note before we move on to future suggestions. While the content itself may be lacking or outright bad, Hoi 4 DLCs almost always excel in the art department, and Man the Guns is no exception. I've special praise for the soundtrack, namely the songs Shatter the Empires and Changing Course. But with all that out of the way, it's time for me to begin rattling off suggestions I came up with for how to expand and flesh out these 4 countries. Now, it doesn't seem like Paradox has any plans for any of these 4 countries in the near future. I imagine some changes will come to the Netherlands as a consequence of the Dutch East Indies getting a focus tree, but that really doesn't count. After all, the USA was barely affected by the Philippines getting a focus tree back in November. But anyways, I don't have any suggestions regarding the naval stuff. That's not my field of interest, and I'll fully admit my knowledge is limited. As usual, these suggestions are limited basically exclusively to the focus trees and country content. Without further ado, let's get started with some suggestions for the United Kingdom. First and foremost, the communist path needs a total overhaul. Having to nerf your country beyond the point of video game reason is not fun and would probably cancel any fun stuff the British communists get to do after securing power, if not for the lack of aforementioned fun stuff. Furthermore, there should be an option to merge most of the decolonized nations together as a way to reduce lag, and the communists must decolonize within 2 years thing should also be removed. Also, Oswald Mosley could use a few extra unique focuses that aren't shared with the monarchists. And speaking of the monarchists, why not allow for players to reclaim the French throne? Every British monarch, from Edward III in 1340 to George III in 1801, asserted that they were the rightful French monarch. The democratic stuff needs some work as well, and I'll fully concede that a lot of these suggestions are little political nitpicks. Firstly, though the Conservative Party held a large majority in 1936, they governed with factions of other parties and independents as part of the national government. This government would last until Neville Chamberlain dissolved it in 1939 in order to form a wartime cabinet. And, due to World War II, elections were postponed until after Germany surrendered. What if the UK doesn't get involved in the war? The government would eventually have to call an election, say in 1940. There's no events for this hypothetical 1940 general election, nor for the actual or alternative 1945 elections. Therefore, I think they should add events for these, cancelling all elections if the UK gets into a major war, and holding one as soon as the war ends. And that should therefore open the door to a Labour Party victory, which would make Clement Attlee the Prime Minister, like in our timeline. Also, during the war, Churchill designated Anthony Eden, his foreign minister, as his successor in the event something happened to him. There could be a mechanic where, like if Per Albin Hansen's bus in Sweden is captured, Churchill's plane crashes or something, and Eden, who actually did succeed Churchill in 1955, becomes Prime Minister. A lot of my suggestions for the United States are similar. Firstly, the Congress mechanic needs to be drastically improved. Perhaps they could utilize the numerous faction mechanics we've been seeing in countries like Greece and Japan, where you can improve your support among certain ideological blocs in Congress, for instance liberal Republicans or Southern Democrats, and depending on how supportive these factions are of your efforts, you can complete certain focuses. Faction sizes would have to be at least somewhat similar to the historical sizes in Congress, and you could probably merge the farmer, labor, and progressive parties with a hypothetical progressive Democrats faction for simplicity's sake. Essentially, you'd have to build coalitions in Congress in order to get stuff done. This would also help the midterm elections make more sense, as the opposition party would likely see their factions increase in size at the expense of the incumbents. Also, they should work the 1936, 1940, and 1944 presidential elections into the gameplay, making it so you have to spend a little bit of time campaigning for the Democratic or Republican nominee in order to ensure an electoral college victory. This should not only change your country leader, but should also add a national spirit or unfireable advisor for the vice president. Perhaps you could even choose the running mate of the incumbent party's nominee. But I'm getting ahead of myself. One thing I'd like to see, even if they limit the elections to just an event in November, is a different Democratic challenger if Roosevelt loses. If Landon or Wilkie were to win in 1936 or 1940 respectively, the Dems would probably put up someone like James Farley or John Nance Garner as their nominee in the next election, and not FDR again. But in the name of self-restraint, I'll stop gushing about my ideas ideas there. I have one more suggestion concerning the fascist path. If you complete the America First focus, it should begin a power struggle between the fascists and President Landon, similar to pre-war Spain, or the Soviet opposition paths where Stalin completes his branch in the focus tree. This could create a fun and more realistic run, where you have to outwit the government's attempts to shut you up while you prepare for your eventual seizure of power. In fact, Landon should be the one who leads the opposition government in Boston once the Civil War begins, even if MacArthur still makes himself the American Caesar. And the less I say about the communist path, the better. For Mexico, I'd like to see a monarchist path separate from the regular political branch, where you can install Maria de Iturbide as the Empress of the Third Mexican Empire. Perhaps you could also install some tribal leader as a spiritual successor to the Aztecs or Maya, or maybe even restore New Spain under a Spanish Bourbon. Something else that could be neat is, rather than simply annexing all of the former Mexican cession, you could reestablish the Republic of Texas as a neutral border state. I know that isn't very realistic, but it's Hoi 4. Who cares? Lastly, for the Netherlands, I really don't have any suggestions. For me, they'll always be kind of boring. Maybe you could do something with Flavoland, but you can't add land where none exists like that, so I guess not. Kind of an underwhelming way to finish this section, but...
Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
Being a pirate is a recipe. Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate. You are a pirate.
In conclusion, Man the Guns is a DLC that, at least for me, elicits a tired sense of apathy. I can't even recall being very enthused about it when I bought it, at full price by the way, and it's probably the most forgettable of the major Hoi 4 DLCs in my opinion. But hey, maybe you love this DLC more than your own flesh and blood, and if so, that's okay, to each their own and all that. Let me know your thoughts on both the DLC and my thoughts about said DLC in the comments. See you in another 8 months for the next DLC review or whatever. And remember, drink your water and stop falling over.